Australia's underworld is changing, and it's happening faster than anyone expected. For years, the Rebels Motorcycle Club ruled the streets, with over 70 chapters, 2,000 members, and a grip on nearly 80% of Adelaide's nightlife. But that old-school power is slipping away. Now, a new player has taken the stage, the Albanian Mafia. Quiet, connected, and ruthless. They don't need tattoos or patches to show power. They control billion-dollar drug routes and money laundering operations that reach across continents. In 2023-24 alone, Aussies consumed over 12,800 kilograms of meth, feeding an underground economy worth billions. From Operation Ironside's massive sting to the shocking hit on Nick Martin, one thing's clear. The fight for control isn't about bikes anymore. It's about networks, money, and power in the shadows. And before we dive deep into how the Rebels lost their crown, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the dark truth behind Australia's criminal empire. The Old Guard, when bikies ruled the streets. For decades, the Rebels Motorcycle Club wasn't just another biker gang, they were the law of the streets. Born in Brisbane back in 1969 under the name the Confederates, this small band of motorcycle lovers grew into something far more powerful. Over time, the Rebels became a criminal empire, one that stretched far beyond Australia's borders. At their height, they had over 70 chapters across the country and more than 1,000 patched members. That made them the biggest outlaw motorcycle club in Australia, hands down. Their patch said it all: a Confederate flag, a skull wearing a cap, and that notorious 1% badge, marking them as the outlaws who lived by their own rules. But here's what made the Rebels different. They weren't just bikers looking for fights. Under the leadership of Alex Vella, a man known in the underworld as the Maltese Falcon, they evolved into something far more dangerous. Vella wasn't just a tough guy, he was smart. He saw what most gang leaders didn't, that the real power wasn't in street violence, it was in building systems, networks, and influence. Instead of chasing chaos, he built connections. Drug trafficking, money laundering, even legitimate businesses that helped clean their dirty cash, the Rebels had their hands in everything. They didn't just run the streets, they ran the economy that moved in the shadows. By the early 2000s, South Adelaide police estimated that nearly 80% of Adelaide's nightclubs and bars use security companies owned by bikie gangs, and right at the center of that network was the Rebels. Just think about that for a second. These weren't just guys on Harleys wearing leather jackets. They were businessmen, operating under the radar, controlling multi-million-dollar revenue streams.
At their peak, the Rebels alone had around 2,000 members. Across the country, there were about 35 outlaw motorcycle gangs, totaling roughly 3,500 patched bikies. But even among them, the Rebels stood tall. They were the old guard, the ones everyone else looked up to or feared. But the thing about empires built on intimidation is this: they only last as long as people are afraid. And fear, as the Rebels would soon find out, can turn on you just as fast as it made you powerful. The new players: Albanian precision versus bikie chaos. While the bikies were out in the open, brawling in the streets, firing shots, and making headlines, another kind of criminal organization was quietly taking shape behind the scenes. They didn't show up on Harleys, and they didn't wear leather vests covered in patches. The Albanians came in with something far more dangerous: intelligence, patience, and a plan. They entered the country not with guns blazing, but with fake passports, migration lawyers, and a level of organization that made the bikies look like amateurs. And here's where it gets fascinating. According to the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, the Albanian clans operate on what they call a 5-stage life cycle. It starts simple. Stage 1, they recruit people from their home regions, often luring them in with promises of work overseas. Stage 2, they bring those people into Australia using fraudulent documents or false visa claims. sometimes dragging out the process for years through appeals. Stage 3, once they're here, they find ways to stay, using trusted migration agents or claiming that returning home would put them in danger because of family blood feuds. Stage 4, they move into criminal activity, drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized operations. And by stage 5, when someone finally gets arrested, it doesn't even matter, because by then they've already moved their money, built their networks, and restarted the entire cycle elsewhere. This isn't chaos. This isn't random. It's a system, cold, efficient, and calculated. Between 2015 and 2020, Australian law enforcement noticed something incredible. In 5 out of 7 major organized crime investigations in South Australia, the primary suspects all came from one place, Skoder, a single Albanian county. That's not coincidence. That's structure. That's industry-level crime. Now here's where the contrast really hits. While the rebels and other bikie gangs were still focused on their patches, local turf, and who ran which nightclub, the Albanians were playing an entirely different game. They were thinking global. They weren't trying to own a city block. They were building international pipelines connecting drug supply from Europe and South America straight into Australian demand. They were businessmen running crime like a corporation.
Victoria Police Commander Paul O'Halloran summed it up perfectly. He said Albanian gangsters in Australia can show extreme violence and are regarded by detectives as highly dangerous. But that's not what truly makes them dangerous. It's their intelligence. They use professional facilitators for visas, legal matters, and paperwork. They know the system inside out, and they know how to exploit it. Compare that to the old school bikie style. When the rebels or other clubs had problems, they didn't call lawyers, they called each other out in parking lots. Think back to the Milpera massacre in 1984, a full-blown gunfight between the Comancheros and the Bandidos that left 7 people dead in broad daylight. Or the Sydney airport brawl in 2009, where a Hells Angels associate was beaten to death in front of horrified witnesses. These violent displays might have terrified rivals, but they also made bikies public enemies. Every punch, every shooting, every news headline gave police more power to crack down, and with that came tougher laws, stronger surveillance, and a public that was completely behind law enforcement. The bikies were still fighting for attention. The Albanians, they were quietly taking over. The Albanian advantage, invisible empire. The real genius of the Albanian Mafia isn't just how they operate, it's how they manage to stay invisible. See, the bikies wear their criminal identity like a badge of pride. Their jackets literally tell you who they are and what they stand for. But the Albanians, they've mastered the art of blending in. You won't find them roaring down highways or flashing gang colors. You'll find them behind desks as real estate agents, businessmen, even migration consultants. They don't rely on intimidation because they don't need to. They're not trying to rule over a street or a block. They're after something much bigger, the market itself. Take the case uncovered in 2024, where an Albanian syndicate was caught running multiple cannabis grow houses hidden inside Melbourne rental properties. And the level of organization here is shocking. They had a real estate agent on their payroll whose entire job was to scout rental homes owned by overseas investors, properties that no one would personally inspect. Once they secured a lease, they'd convert these homes into industrial-scale cannabis factories, often leaving behind hundreds of thousands of dollars in property damage. And this wasn't just a few guys growing weed in a garage. This was a fully structured criminal business, one that had infiltrated legitimate sectors, exploited loopholes, and turned illegal operations into sustainable, money-making machines.
The numbers paint a clear picture. In a single police raid, authorities seized 96 kilograms of cannabis, $270,000 in cash, and designer watches hidden in the ceiling cavities of just 2 houses. But here's the thing, that was just one group, one city, and one investigation. So how many more are still out there, running quietly under the radar? What the Albanians have built is more than just a crime network. It's an economic system. While the bikies are still battling over which suburb belongs to who, the Albanians are controlling the entire supply chain, from production to profit. They don't wear patches, they don't need flashy motorcycles or public displays of power, because their strength isn't in fear, it's in finance. They've taken organized crime and turned it into a business empire so seamless that most people wouldn't even realize they're dealing with criminals at all. Operation Ironside, the game changer. Everything changed in 2021, and it all began with something that sounds straight out of a spy thriller. For 3 years, the FBI and Australian Federal Police were secretly watching the criminal underworld from the inside, without anyone realizing it. They had created an encrypted messaging app called Anom, which they handed out to criminals around the world. What no one knew was that every message sent through that app was being read by law enforcement in real time. And when the trap was finally sprung, the scale of what they uncovered was staggering. Across Australia, 224 suspects were arrested on more than 500 criminal charges. Police seized 37 metric tons of drugs and nearly $35 million in cash. But more than just numbers, Operation Ironside pulled back the curtain on something far bigger, the real structure of Australia's criminal world. And what it revealed completely changed the game. Among those caught in the operation were members of Italian mafia groups, outlaw motorcycle gangs, Asian crime syndicates, and Albanian organized crime networks. But what stood out in the data shocked even investigators. The bikies, who had always been seen as the face of Australia's criminal scene, were no longer the ones pulling the strings. The encrypted messages told a different story. They showed Albanian crime groups coordinating massive drug imports, running money laundering operations, and managing international networks with a level of sophistication that rivaled and in many cases surpassed traditional organized crime. They weren't just part of Australia's underworld economy anymore, they were running it. One of the most disturbing discoveries was just how deep their influence went. Investigators found that Albanian groups had actually infiltrated Australia's migration system. They had figured out how to use legitimate immigration channels to bring in key members of their operations, all while keeping everything on paper perfectly clean. What Operation Ironside proved, once and for all, was that the old guard, the bikies who once ruled the streets, had been outplayed. The new power in Australia's underworld wasn't loud or reckless or covered in tattoos. It was quiet, strategic, and completely invisible. The rebels' decline, empire in freefall. While the Albanian groups were quietly building their invisible empire, the rebels were tearing themselves apart from the inside. The assassination of Nick Martin wasn't just a brutal hit. It was the moment the cracks in the rebels' empire began to show. It marked the start of an internal collapse that would shake the club to its very core. And the details of that hit tell you everything about how the criminal world had changed. The shooter wasn't some rival bikie or hot-headed street enforcer. He was a 35-year-old former Army sniper, a man who'd served in Iraq, a trained marksman working for a shadowy organization that allegedly operated in war zones across the globe, a professional killer for hire, reportedly paid $150,000 by David James Pye, a former rebel who'd switched sides to join the Comancheros. The planning behind it was chillingly precise. This wasn't a spontaneous act of revenge. It was a military-style operation. The assassin spent weeks studying Martin's life, going through his social media, tracking his movements, and even using a drone to scout his home and monitor his security setup. He visited the Perth Motorplex multiple times, carefully observing Martin's usual seat, studying the layout, and calculating the perfect spot to take the shot. This wasn't the work of your average bikie hitman. This was something far more advanced. Someone with real resources, training, and international connections had decided that Nick Martin needed to die. And when the moment came, they executed it with chilling precision. But the real shock to the rebels didn't come from that bullet. It came 3 years later. In May 2024, 36 members of the rebels walked away from the club in what became the largest mass resignation in Australian underworld history. And these weren't low-level members or fresh recruits looking for an easy exit. These were veterans, men who'd built their entire reputations within the organization. They kept their Harleys, but they gave up their patches. It was an open act of defiance that sent shockwaves through Australia's criminal scene. This wasn't about internal politics or petty leadership disputes. It was a realization, a hard truth, that the old way of doing things no longer worked. While the bikies were busy fighting each other, bringing unwanted attention from police and the media, other groups, especially the Albanians, were quietly taking control of the most profitable parts of the underworld. The bikies still had the image, the noise, the presence, but the real power, it had already slipped through their fingers.
The money trail. Who really controls the profits? If you really want to know who runs Australia's underworld, don't look at who's fighting in the streets. Look at who's controlling the money. Because in organized crime, money always tells the truth. Australia remains one of the most profitable drug markets in the world, and right now, methamphetamine use is at record-breaking levels. According to the latest national wastewater data, Australians consumed around 12,815 kilograms of meth in 2023-24. That's up 21% from the previous year. Let that sink in. That's billions of dollars moving through the black economy every single year. But the real question is, who's actually pocketing that money? The traditional bikie gangs are still part of the scene, sure, but their role has shrunk. They're mostly stuck at the street level now, running local distribution, acting as enforcers, and keeping control over territory. The big profits, the importation, the wholesale operations, and the international coordination have quietly shifted into the hands of more organized and sophisticated networks. Even the Australian Federal Police have admitted it. Outlaw motorcycle gangs have started to move offshore, setting up chapters across Southeast Asia just to maintain control over the global supply chains. The Comancheros, Hells Angels, Bandidos, and Lone Wolf all now have international footprints. Some of their members even live abroad, temporarily or permanently, in countries where they can source methamphetamine, heroin, and cocaine for the Australian market. But here's the key detail most people miss. Building and maintaining offshore supply chains requires a completely different kind of operation. It's not just about muscle anymore, it's about logistics, finance, and connections that cross borders. And that's exactly where the Albanian organized crime groups have the upper hand. They've been perfecting these international networks for decades, building money laundering channels, cultivating partnerships, and developing the kind of infrastructure that lets them move product, people, and profit across continents without ever getting their hands dirty. So while the bikies are busy trying to adapt, the Albanians are already running the game, playing on a level the old school clubs can't easily reach. And the numbers keep proving it. In September 2025, Operation Vitreous uncovered just how big this trade has become. Police seized 2.98 tons of illicit drugs and charged 1,246 people nationwide. The operation focused on 1,4-butadiol, a chemical solvent used to manufacture GHB, showing just how quickly these groups evolve, always ready to exploit the next profitable market before anyone else even sees it coming. In the end, the story of who really runs Australia isn't told through gang colors or turf wars anymore. It's written in bank transfers, supply routes, and drug shipments that stretch across oceans. And on that battlefield, the Albanians are miles ahead.
The invisible war. Technology versus tradition. The modern war for control of Australia's underworld doesn't play out on the streets anymore. There are no roaring convoys, no bar fights spilling into the headlines. Today, the real fight happens in the shadows, through encrypted messaging apps, shell companies, and money laundering systems that can quietly move millions across borders without ever setting off alarms. And in this new kind of battlefield, the Albanians are winning. They've mastered a system built on technology, precision, and invisibility, because they understand something the bikies never quite learned. The most powerful criminal is the one you never see coming. While the bikie gangs spent decades building power through reputation and intimidation, the Albanian syndicates built something far more dangerous: efficiency. They don't need public shows of dominance. They don't need to be feared. They operate quietly, and that's exactly why they've been so effective. Take the case of a Victorian man arrested in 2024, accused of working with Albanian organized crime. He wasn't caught dealing drugs or running protection rackets.
His role was even more critical. He was allegedly supplying ghost encrypted communication devices, the kind used by high-level criminals to coordinate operations in total secrecy. This wasn't street crime. This was infrastructure, the digital backbone of a criminal network. And the sophistication doesn't stop there. According to Austrac, Australia's financial intelligence agency, their investigations have been key in exposing how Albanian syndicates are laundering drug money through legitimate businesses, often using real companies to hide the flow of illegal cash. These operations don't look like the old-school criminal setups you can dismantle with a police raid or a few surveillance photos. You can't just storm a clubhouse or tail a convoy anymore. Because the new underworld doesn't live in plain sight. It lives online, in spreadsheets, offshore accounts, and encrypted chats. And that's the difference between the old and the new. The rebels ruled with intimidation. The Albanians rule with innovation. The new reality, a multipolar criminal world. So, who really runs Australia's underworld in 2025? The truth is, it's no longer as simple as bikie gangs fighting for turf or settling scores with violence. The criminal landscape has completely evolved. It's not about who owns the streets anymore. It's about who controls the money, the networks, and the systems behind the scenes.
What we're seeing now is a new kind of underworld, a multipolar criminal world, where different groups dominate different parts of the illegal economy. Outlaw motorcycle gangs still hold strong influence on the ground. They control street-level drug distribution, handle protection rackets, and maintain their local presence. The Rebels, for example, remain the biggest motorcycle club in Australia, with 29 active chapters across the country. They're still here, and they're still powerful. But the real power, the big money, the sophisticated networks is shifting elsewhere. The most profitable and organized operations, like international drug trafficking, large-scale money laundering, and the manipulation of legal systems, are increasingly being controlled by Albanian organized crime and other ethnically based networks. These groups don't need to flash their power. They run things quietly, efficiently, and with precision. The data backs this up. Bikies might still make up the largest organized crime group in terms of numbers across Australia and New Zealand, but their activities are shrinking into what experts call lifestyle crimes. Things like fights, traffic offenses, low-level drug possession, and street disorder. Meanwhile, the heavy hitters, the ones running international operations, are playing an entirely different game. They move product across continents, clean money through legitimate businesses, and exploit weak spots in the system, all while staying off the radar. Even law enforcement operations tell the same story. Take National Task Force Morpheus. It's focused on outlaw motorcycle gangs. The task force made over 100 arrests and seized weapons, drugs, and illegal tobacco. But these are mostly local busts, surface-level crimes. Compare that with recent operations against Albanian organized crime. Those revealed something completely different. Massive cannabis cultivation setups, global money laundering networks, and even manipulation of Australia's immigration systems. This is the new reality. Bikies still make noise, but the Albanians and other organized crime groups are quietly rewriting the rules and running the kind of empire that doesn't need patches, motorcycles, or street wars to stay on top. The future of Australian organized crime. The assassination of Nick Martin wasn't just the end of one man's story. It was the end of an era. His death marked the fall of the old way Australia's underworld used to work. The days when bikie gangs openly fought for control, flexing their dominance through territory, violence, and fear, those days are fading. What's rising in their place is something far smarter, far quieter, and much harder to stop.
The Albanian organized crime groups represent what the future of crime in Australia looks like. Global connections, advanced technology, and deep roots inside legitimate business and social systems. They don't need to wave flags or make threats because they're not fighting over local turf. While bikies argue over who runs the streets, the Albanians have already taken control of the supply chains that keep those streets supplied. That doesn't mean the old-school bikie clubs are gone. The rebels, the Hells Angels, the Bandidos, they're still around, still powerful, and some are adapting fast. Many have started moving offshore, setting up international chapters and networks to stay in the game. But it's clear, their days of total dominance over Australia's criminal world are behind them. The criminal world now runs on invisibility, global reach, and the ability to blend in. The ones who succeed are the ones who can move money through legitimate companies, hide behind real businesses, and communicate using encryption that keeps them untouchable. And right now, Albanian crime syndicates are doing all of that better than anyone else. For law enforcement, that's a nightmare. You can raid a bikie clubhouse, seize weapons, or track their movements, but how do you take down a criminal network that looks, on paper, like a legitimate business? How do you stop an organization that launders millions through real estate, logistics firms, or import-export companies? The uncomfortable truth is that Albanian organized crime has already taken deep root in Australia's underworld. The question isn't if they'll expand further, it's whether the police, the government, and even the system itself can evolve fast enough to keep up. Because the fight for control of Australia's criminal empire isn't over, it's just changed shape. The rebels might have lost their grip, but that doesn't mean the war is finished. It's just gone underground. And in that underground world, the most powerful players aren't the ones you see riding in formation. They're the ones you never see at all.